The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time, and it came not through any back channel or military relay, but through the most official frequency the Galactic Conclave had ever used to speak to a lesser species. It came with a golden seal, a multi-language greeting, and the kind of careful wording that took committees of diplomats weeks to agree upon. It said, in 32 languages, that humanity was invited to join the Grand Peace Conference aboard the neutral deep space station, known as Axiom Reach, and that the Galactic Conclave was pleased to extend this honor to the people of Earth. The convoy traveled for 11 days through open space before it reached the outer marker buoys of Axiom Reach. 11 days was a long time to be moving through nothing, and for most of the diplomatic staff aboard the lead vessel, it meant long meals, longer briefings, and the kind of restless energy that came from knowing something large was coming without being able to do very much about it. Ambassador Hale spent her time reviewing alien legal texts and practicing her Drethari, the formal dialect used in conclave sessions, until she could speak it without an accent. She was already fluent. She wanted to be more than fluent. She wanted to be so precise that not a single word she said could be misread. 3 ships back in the convoy, Commander Jet Okafor did not practice languages. He ran checklists instead. He had been running them since the convoy departed, going through them methodically, the way a surgeon checks instruments before an operation, not because he expected to find something wrong, but because the checking itself was part of the preparation. You checked until the checking became habit, and then the habit kept you alive in the moments when there was no time to think. The ship he occupied was officially listed as a logistics and supply vessel. Its manifest recorded it as carrying food stores, medical equipment, spare parts for communications arrays, and a team of 22 support technicians. All of that was true. What the manifest did not record was the second layer beneath all of it. The modular weapons platforms had been the hardest thing to move without detection. They were not small and they were not simple, but they had been designed with exactly this kind of problem in mind. Earth's weapons engineers, who were a creative group of people even in the best of times, had spent 8 months breaking the platforms down into components that looked like something else entirely. Power coupling arrays that were actually firing mechanisms. Structural support braces that were actually frame sections. Targeting systems packed inside what appeared to be standard atmospheric sensor equipment. Alone, each piece was unremarkable. Together, assembled in the right order by someone who knew what they were doing, they became 3 fully functional weapons platforms capable of controlling any enclosed space they were placed in. Commander Okafor knew what he was doing. He had assembled and disassembled the platforms enough times in training that he could do it in the dark, in a hurry, with his hands shaking from cold. His team could manage it in under 4 hours. He was aiming for 3. The electronic warfare suite was easier to hide, mostly because it had been built to be hidden. It was the product of 30 years of human reverse engineering work on conclave sensor technology, a long and patient process of studying every scan that had ever been run on a human vessel and figuring out exactly what the scanners were looking for and how to look like something else instead. The suite was tucked inside what was logged as a long-range communications relay, and it could, when activated, effectively blind every surveillance and communications system on a station the size of Axiom Reach for a period of between 1 and 4 hours, depending on how hard the station's systems fought back. Okafor was planning for the low end and hopping for the high. The 63 members of his special operations team were, in his honest opinion, the best part of the whole arrangement. They had been chosen carefully from a much larger pool, selected not just for skill, but for a specific kind of discipline that was harder to find and harder to train than marksmanship or close combat ability. They needed to be able to sit quietly in a crowded room full of alien dignitaries, wearing the uniform of a clerical assistant or a lab technician, for hours or days, without giving anything away. They needed to be able to smile at the right moments, look bored at the right moments, and respond to instructions in the right tone of voice. They needed to look so completely unremarkable that no one would think to look twice. They were very good at it. HFY had watched them work during the simulations back on Earth and had felt something close to pride. They moved through crowds like water, present and invisible at the same time. Several of them had spent years doing this kind of work in human political environments before they were recruited. The transition to alien environments required adjustment, but the core skill was the same: be there without being seen. 3AU behind the convoy, running without any active systems, and therefore producing essentially no scan signature at all. Director Solin's shadow vessel drifted in the dark. It was a small ship, barely large enough to be called a ship at all, and it carried a crew of 9 plus Solin herself, and a communication setup that was entirely passive, able to receive signals from enormous distances without transmitting anything that could be detected. Solin sat in the center of her small operations room, surrounded by screens, and drank tea from a metal cup and watched everything. She had assets on Axiom Reach already. 3 people placed there in the weeks before the convoy departed, each of them occupying a perfectly ordinary role in the station's daily operation: a maintenance technician, a catering supervisor, an administrative assistant attached to one of the smaller conclave delegations. None of them knew about each other. That was by design. What they all knew was how to observe and how to transmit what they observed in small, compressed packages that looked like routine station data traffic, and were, in fact, detailed reports on Axiom Reach's layout, security patterns, internal communications, and the movements of its senior staff. Solin had been reading those reports every day. The picture they painted was not surprising, but it was useful. The station had more security personnel than a neutral conference facility should need. Certain corridors had been sealed off under the description of maintenance work that did not appear on inspection to involve any actual maintenance. And 3 days before the convoy's arrival, a cluster of conclave warships had repositioned to a formation that had no obvious diplomatic purpose, but had a very obvious tactical one. She wrote a short summary of her findings and added it to the secure file she was maintaining for Admiral Voss. Then she poured more tea and went back to watching. Aboard the lead diplomatic vessel, Ambassador Hale was meeting with her legal team to go through the specific language of the accord they expected to be presented with. They did not have a copy. No advance text had been shared, which was itself a small irregularity since conference accords were typically circulated weeks before signing. But Hale had been studying conclave legal precedents for 2 decades, and she had a good sense of what the document would say. It would be framed as an agreement of mutual cooperation and shared security. It would use language about protection and stability and the benefits of unified governance. And somewhere in the middle of it, in careful, dense legal phrasing that would take a specialist to untangle, it would contain the mechanism by which Earth's independent military authority would be transferred to conclave oversight. She went through every variation she could think of with her team, mapping out the language they would use to counter each one. Her legal advisor, a small, precise man named Dr. Elliot Sarr, had prepared 43 separate analytical responses to 43 different versions of the problematic clauses. Hale read all of them and made notes in the margins. She was not going to be caught without an answer to anything. On the final night before the convoy reached Axiom Reach, HFY walked through the ships alone just to feel the state of things. The special operations team was resting. The equipment was checked and rechecked. Everything that needed to be ready was ready. He stood for a while at a viewport and looked at the stars, which looked the same out here as they did from anywhere, and thought about the decision tree he carried in his head. If the conference was real, they signed and went home, and that was good. If it was not real, they did something else instead, and that would be harder but not impossible. He had been in harder situations. He had gotten out of them. He expected to get out of this one too. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept soundly, which was, in its own way, the most professional thing about him. Admiral Seraph Voss read it twice. Then she set it down on the long glass table in the United Earth Command War Room in Geneva, looked at the 12 faces staring back at her, and said nothing for a long moment. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the climate systems and the faint sound of rain hitting the windows outside. Geneva was always raining these days, it seemed. "Well," said Ambassador Lyra Hale from the far end of the table, her voice calm and precise the way it always was, "they finally called." She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and dark eyes that missed very little. She had spent 30 years in alien courts, alien meeting rooms, and alien silences. She knew what a carefully worded invitation looked like. She also knew what a carefully worded trap looked like. Sometimes they were the same thing. The Galactic Conclave was not a small organization. It was a coalition of 31 recognized civilizations, spread across 4 star systems, with a combined fleet that dwarfed anything humanity had managed to build in its 247 years of space travel. They had been watching Earth for decades, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with what felt very much like impatience. Humanity had been a problem they had not quite figured out how to solve. Humans were too aggressive to ignore and too resourceful to simply push aside. And now, apparently, they had decided that the cleanest solution was to invite them to a peace conference. Ambassador Hale thought that was very interesting indeed. She was not alone in her suspicions. Within 6 hours of the message arriving, Earth's intelligence networks had begun pulling at threads. Director Myra Solon, head of the United Earth Intelligence Service, had put every analyst she had onto the problem, and within a day the picture that emerged was not a comfortable one. Conclave military vessels had quietly repositioned themselves in the weeks before the invitation was sent. The station called Axiom Reach, officially described as a neutral conference facility, had recently undergone what the Conclave called routine infrastructure upgrades. And perhaps most telling of all, every species that had been invited to this particular conference had one thing in common. They had all, at some point in the last century, been on the Conclave's list of civilizations to be brought under what the Conclave called administrative protection, which was a polite way of saying absorbed. Director Solon put her report on Admiral Voss's desk at 3 in the morning. Voss read it with a cup of cold coffee and a face that gave nothing away. When she finished, she called Hale. "You've seen Solon's report," Voss said. "It was not a question." "I've seen it," Hale replied. There was no sleepiness in her voice despite the hour. "We're going." "Yes," Voss said, "we are." There was a brief silence between them, the kind that 2 people share when they have already agreed on the hard part and are now simply letting it settle. "I'll need full diplomatic staff," Hale said. "Cultural liaisons, legal advisors, translators, everything that looks correct." "You'll have it," Voss said, "and I'll need something from you in return." "You need me to not ask what's going into the cargo holds," Hale said. Another silence, something like that. Hale almost smiled. "Understood, Admiral." The next 2 weeks were, on the surface, a flurry of diplomatic preparation. Earth's media watched with excitement as the convoy began to take shape at the Geneva orbital platform. There were sleek diplomatic vessels, polished and formal, bearing the blue and white colors of the United Earth Command. There were supply ships, medical vessels, and a small escort of standard patrol craft. It looked exactly like what a peace conference convoy was supposed to look like. The Galactic Conclave's observers, watching from a distance, would have found very little to question. Except that Commander Jet Akafer was not a diplomat. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered man from Lagos who had spent 17 years in United Earth Special Operations, and who had, over the course of those 17 years, become very skilled at making things look like other things. He walked through the cargo bays of the convoy ships with a tablet and a calm expression, checking manifests that said one thing and contained another, nodding to technicians who were dressed as maintenance workers and were very definitely not maintenance workers. High Counselor Drethvan of the Galactic Conclave, sitting in his chambers on Axiom Reach, received a routine scan report of the incoming human convoy. He reviewed it briefly and found it unremarkable. Diplomatic vessels, supply ships, a small escort, exactly what he had expected. He set the report aside and returned to the far more important matter of the ceremony he was planning for the conference's final day, when the humans would be presented with the Accord of Unified Governance and asked to sign. He was already thinking about what to say when they hesitated. Humans always hesitated, but they always signed in the end. Every species did. He did not know, and had no way of knowing, that the convoy moving slowly through deep space toward Axiom Reach carried more than diplomats and goodwill. He did not know about the modular weapons platforms broken down into components and packed inside sealed containers labeled as medical equipment. He did not know about the electronic warfare suite disguised as a communications array. He did not know about the 63 special operations soldiers currently wearing the uniforms of clerical staff and lab technicians. And he did not know that Director Solon had already placed 3 of her people inside Axiom Reach weeks ago, waiting quietly. The invitation had said come in peace. Humanity had accepted graciously, professionally, and with every appearance of goodwill. And then, out of sight and without fanfare, they had packed for everything else as well. Axiom Reach was beautiful in the way that powerful things are often beautiful, which is to say that its beauty was deliberate, and its deliberateness was a little unsettling once you noticed it. The station was enormous, a curving structure of pale alloy and dark glass that hung in deep space like a crown someone had dropped and left floating. Its docking bays were wide and well lit, and when the human convoy arrived they were greeted by a full ceremonial escort, small formal vessels in the gold and silver colors of the galactic conclave, guiding the human ships in with a precision that felt more like herding than welcoming. Ambassador Hale noticed this but said nothing about it. She smiled pleasantly at the viewport and thought her own thoughts. The station's grand conclave hall was designed to impress, and it succeeded. It was a vast circular space with a ceiling that was either real glass or a very convincing imitation of it, showing the stars above in a slow panoramic rotation. The delegations of 31 species were arranged around a central floor in tiered seating, each section marked with the colors and symbols of its civilization. The human delegation was placed near the outer edge, not quite the last tier but close, which was a small thing and probably meaningless, and which Hale noted anyway. High Counselor Drethvon opened the conference with a speech that lasted 40 minutes and said very little of substance, while saying it in a way that sounded deeply meaningful. He was a tall being. His species ran to height, and to a kind of angular grace that made them look like they had been designed to stand at podiums, and he spoke with the confidence of someone who had never had to question whether a room was listening. Hale listened with complete attention and a pleasant expression, and catalogued every word. The first day of the conference was dedicated to what the agenda called introductory sessions, which meant that various delegations stood up and made formal statements of goodwill and cooperation that everyone present understood to be theatrical, but that protocol required. Hale made Earth's statement in Drethari so precise and so perfectly accented that there was a brief, small silence in the hall before the translation systems finished processing it, and she saw Drethvon look at her for just a moment with something that was not quite the casual assessment he had been making of the human delegation up to that point. Good, she thought, let him recalibrate. Admiral Voss stood behind her and slightly to the right throughout the day's sessions, the way she had agreed to stand. Visible but not prominent, a presence that said security detail to anyone looking casually. Voss was very good at looking like a security detail when she wanted to. She was also, without being obvious about it, mapping the room, the positions of the conclave's ceremonial guard, the locations of the exits, the placement of the surveillance system she could see, and her best guess at the ones she could not. The small things started on the second day. The first was the exits. Axiom Reach had 11 publicly accessible corridors leading from the Grand Conclave Hall to other parts of the station. By the morning session on the second day, 4 of them were sealed with small signs posted indicating routine maintenance. Voss noted this. 1 sealed corridor was unremarkable, 2 was possible, 4 was a pattern. The second thing was the guard. The conclave's ceremonial security presence had doubled overnight. The new personnel were dressed in the same formal uniforms as the original detail, but they moved differently, with a kind of alert stillness that ceremonial guards generally did not bother with because there was no real reason to. These ones were watching the room rather than framing it. They were real security in formal uniforms, and whoever had placed them was confident that no one would look closely enough to notice the difference. HFY's team noticed. He received 3 separate quiet reports before lunch and compiled them into a short message for Voss that he passed to her through a junior staff member who was not a junior staff member. Voss read it during what appeared to be a check of her personal communications device and did not change her expression. The third thing was the Murian envoy. The Murian were a small species, physically and politically, known primarily for their work in interstellar botanical research, and for staying carefully neutral in any conflict that did not directly involve them. Their representative at the conference was a being called Follows, elderly by Murian standards, with the patient look of someone who had been watching the powerful do what the powerful do for a very long time. During the second day's formal banquet, which was long and elaborate and featured food that the human delegation ate carefully and without complaint, Follows found a seat near Ambassador Hale. They talked about plants for 20 minutes. Follows was genuinely interested in Earth's botanical diversity, and Hale was genuinely knowledgeable about it, and the conversation was entirely real. Near the end of it, as the table around them got noisier with other conversations, and the attention of the nearest security personnel drifted elsewhere, Follows pressed a small data chip into Hale's hand with the practiced smoothness of someone who had done this before. Their eyes met briefly. Follows said something polite about the food, and then turned to speak to someone on their other side. Hale closed her hand around the chip and smiled at nothing in particular. She reviewed it later that night in her quarters, using a reader that Solon's people had built specifically for this purpose, one that left no record of use and connected to nothing external. The data on the chip was a document, written in formal conclave administrative language, and it took her 3 reads to fully process what it said. It was an internal planning file, not meant for outside eyes. It outlined the structure of the conference's final session, which was scheduled for the 4th day. That session included a segment labeled the Presentation of the Accord of Unified Governance. The Accord, when read carefully through all of its supporting legal clauses, was precisely what Hale had predicted. It transferred effective control of Earth's military command to the Conclave's Security Directorate. It placed Earth's colonial territories under Conclave administrative oversight for a period of not less than 50 years. And it was structured in such a way that any species signing it gave up the legal, standing to challenge it after the fact. It was a surrender document dressed in the language of partnership. Hale sat with that for a moment. Then she sent a compressed signal to Director Solon's shadow vessel, using a method that looked like background noise in the station's communication traffic, and she passed the document on. Within 2 hours, Solon's reply came back. Confirmed, the Conclave warships outside were now in a full encirclement formation. The exits they could see were not the only exits being controlled. Hale went to sleep at a reasonable hour. She had a long day tomorrow and she needed to be sharp. Voss, meanwhile, sent a single encrypted word to HFY. It was a word they had chosen in the planning sessions back on Earth, back when they were building the decision tree and assigning terms to each branch of it. It was a simple word, a flower name, chosen because it was easy to remember, and because flowers were not the kind of thing that triggered automated security filters. The word was bloom. HFY read it and nodded once to himself in the dark of his bunk. Then he got up, dressed quietly, and went to begin the next stage of preparations. His team, when he woke them, were ready in under 10 minutes. They had been expecting this. They had, in a quiet, professional way, been hopping for it. Sitting still for 3 days had been the hard part. This, the moving part, was what they were built for. The 4th day of the conference began the way the previous days had, with formal ceremony and the kind of careful politeness that large gatherings of powerful entities produce when they are all trying to look civilized at the same time. The Grand Conclave Hall was full. Every delegation was present. The air in the room had that particular quality that comes before something important, a slight extra stillness, the way sound seems to change just before a storm breaks. Several of the non-conclave delegations had the look of beings who had been told they were attending a historic occasion and were not entirely sure if that was a good thing. Ambassador Hale walked to the central podium at the time designated on the agenda for what was officially described as an address by the human delegation. She had not slept much the night before, but she had slept enough, and she had used the remaining hours carefully. She was dressed in formal United Earth diplomatic attire, understated and precise, and she carried nothing except her own preparation and 30 years of knowing how rooms like this worked. She began quietly. She thanked the Galactic Conclave for the invitation. She acknowledged the history of the civilizations present, their achievements, the long and difficult work of building anything resembling stability across the distances of space. She spoke in Drethari and in 3 other conclave languages in rotation, a thing that was not required and was not common, and she did it without hesitation or error, and she watched the room adjust to her the way a room does when it realizes it has underestimated someone. Then she began to take the accord apart. She did not call it a trap. She did not accuse anyone of bad faith. She was far too skilled for that. What she did instead was read specific clauses of the accord aloud, slowly and clearly in the formal language in which they were written, and then explain in plain terms what those clauses actually meant. She was speaking to the room, not to the conclave. She was speaking to the Murian delegation, who were listening with an expression of careful attention. She was speaking to the Selathi, the Vorn, the Kethahara, and the dozen other non-conclave species sitting in this hall who had been invited to witness a signing, and had not, until this moment, been given the full text of what was being signed. Clause by clause, she walked them through it. The language about mutual protection that, legally, transferred military authority. The administrative oversight provisions that, in practice, meant colonial annexation. The stability framework that had no exit mechanism, no review period, no sunset clause. She was not angry. Her voice was level and clear and almost conversational, and that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been, because it meant she was not reacting to something that had surprised her. She had known. She had come prepared, and she was sharing that preparation with every species in the room. High Counselor Drethvan sat very still through all of this. He was not the only one. In the tiered seating around the hall, several delegations had gone quiet in a different way than they had been quiet before. The Murian envoy follows sat with their hands folded, and an expression that a careful observer might have recognized as relief. The Selathi ambassador leaned toward their aide and said something in a low voice. The Kethahara representative, who was known as one of the most expressive beings in the conclave's wider orbit, had gone completely motionless, which for their species meant deep, focused thought. While Hale spoke in the hall, other things were happening in other parts of the station, simultaneously, and with a coordination that had been rehearsed so many times it moved like something organic. Akafar's teams had been moving since the early hours. They had dispersed through Axiom Reach during the previous evening, using the station's maintenance corridors and the access codes that Solon's people had quietly extracted over the past weeks. 3 teams, each carrying components, had reached their assigned positions before the morning session began. The assembly of the weapons platforms had taken 2 hours and 48 minutes. Akafar had noted this with quiet satisfaction. Under 3 hours. They had beaten their target. The platforms were now positioned at 3 key junctions in the station's internal layout: the main power distribution hub, the security control center, and the docking bay command node. They were not active. They were ready. There was a difference, and it was important. Active meant shooting. Ready meant that if anything in the hall went wrong, the response time would be measured in seconds rather than minutes. The electronic warfare suite had gone live at the same moment Hale began speaking. It did not shut the station down. It did something more precise than that. It quietly redirected the station's internal surveillance feeds to show empty corridors and undisturbed rooms, while simultaneously blocking outgoing communications that were not routed through Earth's own encrypted channels. The Conclave's security controllers, watching their screens, saw a peaceful and uneventful station. They did not see Akafar's teams. They did not see the weapons platforms. They did not see the 12 special operations soldiers who had, over the course of the morning, positioned themselves around the conclave's own enforcement personnel inside the hall itself, near enough to be effective and far enough to be invisible. The conclave enforcers posing as diplomatic aides were a different problem. There were 7 of them that Solon's intelligence had identified, positioned around the hall at intervals that were not random. They were there to manage the room if the signing did not go smoothly. They were, every one of them, currently standing within arm's reach of a human who was dressed as a clerical assistant and was professionally capable of resolving that situation without making a noise loud enough to disturb the speech in progress. Nothing had been fired, nothing had been broken, not yet and hopefully not at all. In the dark of open space, 3AU behind the station, Director Solon watched her screens and transmitted 2 things simultaneously. The first was a compressed intelligence file, sent to every non-conclave vessel currently docked at or positioned near Axiom Reach. It contained 14 decades of documented evidence, the conclave's pattern of inviting independent civilizations to conferences, presenting them with accords that sounded cooperative, and using the legal mechanisms of those accords to absorb them. It named the civilizations. It quoted the documents. It included the internal planning files, of which the data Chip Follows had passed to Hale was one small part, and which Solon's network had been accumulating for years. It was thorough and it was sourced, and it was the kind of thing that was very hard to argue with. The second thing she transmitted was a single compressed coordinate package to Fleet Admiral Cora Nash, who was waiting at the edge of sensor range with Earth's Rapid Response Fleet. Nash, on receiving it, brought the fleet out of its dark-running configuration and moved it into visible range of Axiom Reach's external sensors. Not into weapons range, into visible range. There was a difference, and it was also important. The Conclave's external sensor operators saw the human fleet appear and spent approximately 4 seconds not believing what they were seeing before they began generating alerts. The alerts went to security control, which was currently showing them a peaceful and undisturbed station. The conflict between what the external sensors said and what the internal systems showed produced a paralysis of about 30 seconds in the Conclave's response chain, and 30 seconds was, in this situation, a very long time. In the hall, Hale finished speaking. She thanked the room for its attention. She stepped back from the podium. The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that hall had heard in a long time. Then the Selathi ambassador stood up slowly and began to ask questions about the Accord's language that made it very clear they had been listening to every word. Others followed. The room had changed. It was no longer a signing ceremony. It had become something else, something messier and more real, which was in Hale's experience what actual diplomacy looked like when it was happening correctly. A private meeting between High Counselor Drethvon and the human delegation took place 3 hours after the main session ended, in a small room off the station's administrative wing that had been chosen, Hale suspected, because it was one of the few spaces on Axiom Reach that was not currently under the quiet control of someone she had brought with her. She noted this as a sign of intelligence on Drethvon's part. He had assessed the situation, identified what he still controlled, and chosen his ground accordingly. She respected that, in the way that one professional respects another, even when they are on opposite sides of a table. He was alone except for a single aide who stood by the door and said nothing. Hale had Admiral Voss beside her and a legal advisor 1 step behind. The room was small enough that all of them were very aware of each other, which Hale thought was probably good. Small rooms had a way of making the stakes feel real. Drethvon looked at her for a long time before he spoke. He was difficult to read, as his species often was, but she had spent enough time studying them that she could pick up the broad signals, and what she was reading now was not the confidence of the opening days. Something had shifted in it. He was recalculating. She let him finish without hurrying him. "You came prepared," he said finally in Drethari, which she took as a mark of respect since he knew she spoke it well. more prepared than we expected. We usually are, Voss said from beside her. Her voice was not unfriendly, it was simply flat. Drethvan looked at Voss briefly, then back at Hale. What does humanity want from this? Hale had thought about how to answer this question for weeks. She had considered several approaches: the firm approach, the cooperative approach, the legalistic approach. In the end, she had decided on the simplest one, because simple was harder to argue with and left fewer gaps for misunderstanding. Four things, she said. The accord as written is withdrawn. No annexation language, no military oversight, no administrative control clauses. Earth and its colonies retain full sovereignty, defined in terms that a legal team cannot later reinterpret. Any civilizations currently held under conclave administrative protection are given an independent audit of their status, conducted by parties not affiliated with the conclave. And a restructured conference framework is established within 6 months, one with actual representation and actual checks on the power of any single member, including Earth. She paused, then added, in exchange, the intelligence file Director Solon compiled does not go to the general galactic record. The fleet outside returns to Earth space. We stand down everything we brought here, quietly and without announcement, and we participate in the restructured conclave as a genuine partner. Drethvan was silent for a moment. You're not asking for our surrender. No, Hale said. We're asking for what you advertised when you sent the invitation, a peace conference. We'd like to have one. Another long silence. The aide by the door had not moved. You could have released the intelligence file already, Drethvan said. You could have destroyed our credibility with every species on this station before this meeting. Yes, Hale agreed. Why didn't you? She considered how to say this accurately. Because destroying the conclave doesn't help anyone. It just creates a vacuum, and vacuums in interstellar politics tend to be filled by something worse. We don't want the conclave gone. We want it to work the way it's supposed to. That's a different thing. Drethvan looked at her for a long time after that. She did not look away, and neither did he. And the silence between them was the kind that meant something was actually being understood rather than just being heard. Then he nodded, once, a gesture that was not natural to his species, but that he had clearly learned from decades of working with species that used it. 6 months for the restructuring framework is a short timeline, he said. Then we'd better start soon, Hale said. The reformed accord was signed 2 days later, in the Grand Conclave Hall, in front of every delegation, with the full text available to everyone present and no clauses buried in administrative subcategories. It was a shorter document than the original by a considerable margin. Short documents, in Hale's experience, were usually more honest ones, because there was less room to hide things. The signing was not the end of anything. It was closer to the beginning of something difficult, the long, careful work of building an institution that actually functioned rather than one that merely appeared to. 3 non-conclave species formally requested independent reviews of their existing agreements with the conclave within a week of the conference's close. The Selathi ambassador submitted a proposal for a cross-species oversight committee. The Murian delegation, represented by Follows, submitted a proposal for a permanent neutral observer corps. Drethvan, to his credit, did not block any of these proposals. He was many things, and some of them were not admirable, but he was also practical enough to understand when a moment had passed and something new had begun. The human convoy left Axiom Reach 4 days after the signing. The weapons platforms had been disassembled and repacked before the conference ended. The Special Operations Team had, over the final days, quietly blended back into their cover roles and then back into their berths on the convoy ships. HFY did a final walkthrough of every space they had occupied and left nothing behind. He was thorough that way. Director Solon's shadow vessel had already gone dark and moved before the signing ceremony was over. She had seen what she needed to see and had no reason to stay. She spent the return journey writing her report, which was detailed and precise, and noted every decision that had worked, and every assumption that had turned out to be slightly wrong and what to do differently next time. There would always be a next time. That was the nature of the work. Back on Earth, there were no announcements about what had really happened at Axiom Reach. The public record showed a successful diplomatic conference and a new accord signed in good faith by all parties. The classified record showed something considerably more interesting, but classified records were, by definition, not for public consumption. There was a quiet meeting of the United Earth Command Council a week after the convoy returned, held in a secure room in Geneva, and Hale stood at one end of the table and gave a short report that covered the key facts without embellishment. She was not the kind of person who needed to make something sound more dramatic than it was. What had happened was dramatic enough on its own terms. Voss stood at the back of the room with her arms folded, as she usually did in meetings where her role was to observe rather than speak. When Hale finished, the council asked a few questions, which were answered, and then the meeting ended. As people filtered out, Voss caught Hale's eye across the room and nodded once, the slight kind of nod that is not really a nod but is an entire conversation compressed into a small movement. Hale returned it and went to get coffee. The last note on the record belonged to a junior intelligence analyst in Director Solin's office, a young woman 3 years out of university, who had been assigned the task of monitoring the conclave's internal communications in the weeks following the conference, looking for anything relevant. She found a message from Drethvon to his senior counsel, sent 9 days after the conference ended, and she flagged it and added it to the official report, and then sat with it for a while because it struck her as the kind of thing worth sitting with. It read in translation, "Do not mistake their patience for weakness. They came prepared to talk. They were also prepared for everything else. We will not make this mistake again." She filed the report, went home, and over dinner told her partner that her job was sometimes very interesting, without being able to say why. Her partner, who had learned not to ask, said that was good and passed the bread.